Hi, my name's Anna, and I'll be your host for the Class B Commercial Driver's License Driving Test. Most of the information for this training video was taken from the Ohio Commercial Driving Handbook, which you can get from the local license bureau. Other states may have their own version of this handbook, but the basic information is the same. This program will take some of the guesswork out of the CDL test and present it in a video form so you can actually see what you need to do to pass this test. If you've not taken and passed the written exam, you will need to do so before you're eligible to take the driving test. The CDL driving test consists of 3 parts: the pre-trip vehicle inspection test, the basic vehicle control skills test, and the on-road driving test. This program will help you study and practice for all 3 parts of the test. Watch each part as many times as you like until you know the materials. We'll begin with the pre-trip vehicle inspection test. The purpose of the pre-trip inspection is to show the examiner that you can perform a complete safety inspection of the vehicle. During the pre-trip vehicle inspection test, you must point to, touch, and identify each part included in the pre-trip inspection. You must also explain how to properly inspect each part. A pointer can be used to point to and touch each part that you're identifying. Remember, you have to point to and touch the part, identify the part, and explain how to properly inspect each part. If you fail to do all 3 of those things with any part, the examiner will not give you credit for it. You do not have to crawl under the truck to identify any inspection points. Just point to the area you are inspecting, identify the part, and explain what you're looking for. Each vehicle is a little different, so you must become familiar with the vehicle you will be using for the test and know how to identify and inspect each of the required parts. At the beginning of the test, the examiner will give you your instructions. Listen carefully to the instructions for the pre-trip inspection.
For the vehicle inspection, please conduct an inspection of the vehicles as outlined by the recommendations in the CDL Driver's Manual. You may use a vehicle inspection memory aid from the CDL Driver's Manual if you want to. As you do your inspection, point to or touch the things you are inspecting and explain what you are looking for. Terms like good, okay, and fine are not acceptable. Start by inspecting all components visible in the engine compartment. Next, get in your cab and do the in-cab inspection. After you have completed your in-cab inspection, shut off your engine, get out of the vehicle, and continue your external inspection down the driver's side and around to the back of the vehicle. If there is anything different or unique to the underside or the other side of this vehicle, you should also check these items at this time. You have 30 minutes to complete this portion of the test. Within these main steps, you can inspect individual items in any order. Do you have any questions on these instructions before you begin?
No, I do not.
Okay, go ahead and start your pre-trip vehicle inspection.
Now that you have your pre-trip instructions, here's your first tip. Almost every part is fastened or connected in some way by nuts, bolts, brackets, or other fasteners. Those must be identified repeatedly on each part to make sure none of the nuts, bolts, brackets, or other fasteners are loose, damaged, or missing. You must continually repeat that to the examiner with each part. The same goes for all air hoses, hydraulic hoses, water hoses, and wires. Every hose must be inspected for any loose connections or loose fittings, as well as cracks, splits, holes, or leaks, in addition to the other inspection steps needed to inspect that part. If a part has wires connected to it, the wires must be connected properly and checked for any cracks, splits, corrosion, fraying, or other damage to the wires. Remember, you have to tell the examiner that you would check every nut, bolt, fastener, hose, or wire connected to each part as you come to it, along with any other inspection procedures. Finally, you've only been given 30 minutes to complete the entire pre-trip inspection. You do not have to physically inspect each part. You only have to perform a walkthrough explanation of the inspection process. For example, when you point to the tires and tell the inspector that you would use a tire gauge to check for proper inflation, you do not have to stop and actually check the tires with a tire gauge. Just point to the part, identify the part, and explain the proper steps for inspecting that part. The inspector may challenge you at any time and ask you to be more specific about a certain item. Once you've addressed the challenge, move on to the next part. Let's watch as these trained instructors demonstrate the proper way to take the pre-trip inspection test. Pay careful attention to how each item should be inspected.
Okay, at this time, as I approach the vehicle, I would check the overall appearance of it. I would make sure none of the glass is broken. I would check the lights to make sure they're clean, they're not chipped or busted. I would check to make sure the truck is not leaning to one side or the other, which could indicate a broken shock, a broken spring, or a flat tire. I would also check underneath the vehicle, make sure there's no fluids underneath, which would indicate a leak. Okay, now I'm going to check my fuel tank. I'm going to check the fuel tank straps, make sure they're securely mounted by their nuts and bolts, none are broke or missing. I'm going to make sure there's no debris around the fuel tank. I'm going to make sure my fuel tank is not damaged, dented, or busted, and it's not leaking. Then I'm going to check my fuel cap, make sure it's securely mounted and it's not leaking. Now I'm going to open the hood so I can check my engine.
On the engine, identify the radiator recovery tank and indicate that the coolant must be at a safe level. Identify the water pump. It should be securely fastened with none of the nuts and bolts loose or missing. Also, explain that the hose connections and fittings must be secure and the hoses cannot be damaged, cracked, or leaking. Point to the exhaust system and explain that you would make sure it is not loose or damaged and that none of the clamps or brackets are broken, loose, or missing. Also, tell the examiner that you would listen to make sure the exhaust system is not leaking. You do not have to start the truck to listen, just make sure the examiner knows that it would be part of your normal inspection. Point to the alternator and indicate that none of the nuts and bolts should be loose or missing and everything should be securely fastened. You must also make sure the wires are properly connected to the alternator and that none of the wires are loose, cut, cracked, corroded, or frayed. Check the oil to make sure that it is between the add and full mark. Also, check the transmission fluid to make sure that it is at the proper level. Identify the air compressor. Explain that it must be mounted securely to the engine. None of the nuts or bolts are loose or missing, and that you would also check for any oil leaks. Point to the air lines, identify them, and tell the examiner that you're looking to make sure the lines are properly connected, the fittings are secure, and that the lines are not cut, cracked, or leaking. Also, tell the examiner that you would listen for any air leaks.
Now I'm going to check my power steering pump. Make sure it's securely mounted by its nuts and bolts and it's not leaking. It's not bent, damaged, or busted. Then I would check the power steering hoses. Make sure they're properly connected by their fittings, they're not rubbing or leaking, and not cut. Then I would check my power steering reservoir. Make sure it's properly mounted by its nuts and bolts. It's not damaged, not bent, or leaking. And then I would check to make sure it's at the proper level between add and full.
Next, point to the steering gearbox, identify it, and indicate that it should not be leaking and must be properly connected to the frame with no loose or missing nuts or bolts. The fittings should be tight and the hoses should not be loose, cut, cracked, frayed, or leaking. Identify the steering linkage, pitman arm, and drag link, and tell the examiner that you're checking to make sure that they are not bent, cracked, or twisted, and are also free of any debris. You would also check that each part is properly connected by their joints, nut, bolts, and cotter pins, and that nothing is loose or missing.
If you park the truck with the front wheels turned left at a 45-degree angle, it will be easier to identify the inspection points on the front axle and wheels. Also, on the outside of the truck, you only need to inspect along the driver's side of the vehicle to identify inspection points that are on both sides of the truck.
On the front axle, point to the spring mounts and springs to explain that they cannot be cracked, bent, broken, or missing any parts. No bushings, bolts, U-bolts, or nuts can be loose or missing. Next, point to the shock absorber and explain that it cannot be bent, dented, or leaking, and that none of the nuts and bolts are broken, loose, or missing. You would also inspect it for any leaks. Touch the brake chamber with the pointer and explain that you would make sure there are no dents or cracks and listen for any air leaks. It must be securely mounted with no loose connections and free of any debris. You would also check that the slack adjuster has less than 1 inch of free play. Point to the brake air hoses and explain that the fittings must be properly connected and the hoses cannot be cut, cracked, or rubbing. Also explain that you would listen for any air leaks. Identify the brake drum and lining, which must be checked for cracks, dents, and missing parts. You must also make sure that the lining is not dangerously thin and is free of any oil or debris. Point to the front tire and tell the examiner that you would check them for cuts, cracks, cupping, or bulges, and make sure that each tire has more than 4/32 of tread. Indicate that you would also check each tire with a tire gauge for proper inflation. Also, point to the rim and explain that it must be inspected for any cracks, dents, illegal welds, or missing parts. You would also check for proper mounting and make sure the lug nuts are not loose or missing. Point to the hub and explain that it must be properly connected with none of the nuts or bolts loose or missing. Make sure you point to the sight glass and indicate that it has to show the proper level and is not leaking. The mirror mount needs to be identified and mounted securely with none of the nuts or bolts loose or missing. You would also be sure that it is not bent or twisted and is free of any kind of debris. Show the examiner the latch, hinge, and molding and explain that they must be securely fastened with nothing loose, dented, or missing. The side step should be securely mounted by its nuts and bolts. None should be loose or missing, and it should be free of any debris.
The next part of the pre-trip inspection takes place inside the cab. You should have the key to the truck in your pocket. Do not leave the key in the ignition. Also, be sure to climb into the cab using both hands. During the cab inspection, you will actually start the engine and go through a list of checkpoint inspections with the examiner. Be sure to identify and explain every gauge and meter you're checking along with other cab components. If your truck has a manual transmission, you must also indicate when you're using the clutch and shifting gears. This truck has a manual transmission. Let's continue the pre-trip cab inspection.
Okay, now I'm going to install the key. I'm going to make sure that the clutch is in. It's in neutral before I start the vehicle. Allow the clutch. I'm going to start the engine. At this time I will check my oil pressure is rising to a safe operating level. The same with my water temperature, it's rising to a safe operating level. I will check my alternator, make sure it has a charge, a positive charge, which it does, which indicates that my alternator is working properly. I will check my air pressure, make sure it's rising to a safe operating level. Okay, now I will check my left indicator, my right indicator, my four-ways are working properly. I will check my high beams, they're working properly. Now I'm going to do the brake test. You put it into a low gear, releasing the clutch up until you feel the truck start to grab, and checking to make sure the brake will hold. Put it back in neutral, release your parking brake, turn the vehicle off, and then back on. Now you will point at your gauges and you will show that you're losing less than 2 pounds of air per minute. And then I'll apply approximately 90 pounds of pressure. And now I'm losing less than 3 pounds of air per minute. Now at this time, I will start pumping my brakes, and approximately 60 pounds, my warning light or buzzer will come on. Then at approximately 20 pounds, the parking brake should pop.
Now, with the gear shift in the neutral position, start the engine. The mirrors, rear view mirror, and side windows should not be cracked, chipped, or broken, and should be free of any obstructions. The mirrors should also be properly adjusted to your vision. Be sure the windshield is not cracked, chipped, or broken, and is free of any obstruction, and that the windshield wipers and washers are working properly. You must make sure both the heater and defrost are working properly. Also, be sure that both the city and country horns are working properly. The steering wheel should have less than 10 degrees or 2 inches of play. Tell the examiner that the vehicle is equipped with circuit breakers under the dash and does not need any spare fuses. There are also 3 reflective triangles that must be in good condition and properly stored in their box. There is a 10 BC fire extinguisher that must be fully charged and properly mounted in its bracket. The seatbelt must be properly mounted by its nuts and bolts, free of any cuts, tears, frays, or debris, and working properly. At this time, turn off the engine, take the keys with you, and step safely out of the vehicle using both hands.
Well, how are you doing so far? Remember, you do not have to crawl under the truck to identify any inspection parts. Just point to the part, identify it, and explain how it should be inspected. And don't forget, you only have 30 minutes to complete the pre-trip inspection, so let's keep going.
The battery box must be properly mounted to the frame by its nuts and bolts. None are bent, broken, loose, or missing. The battery is properly mounted in the battery box by its brackets. They are not bent, broken, loose, or missing, and the cable should not be frayed or missing. There should also be no leaks. Check the frame and cross members and make sure they're not cut, cracked, bent, or twisted, and are free of any debris. All bolts are tight and none are missing. There are no holes or breaks in the floor of the truck bed. The sideboards are not cut, cracked, broken, or missing any parts, and they are secured by their side post brackets. The drive shaft cannot be bent, twisted, or cracked, and should be properly connected by its U-joints, which are tight and free of debris. Simply point to the exhaust pipe and muffler and indicate that they should be securely mounted by their brackets, straps, nuts, and bolts, and should not be bent, broken, or loose. Tell the examiner that you would also listen for any exhaust leaks, but you do not have to start the engine. The side lights and reflectors should be clean and not cracked, broken, or missing. On the drive axle, the spring mounts, spring, and the torque leaf should not be cracked, bent, broken, twisted, or missing any parts. Also check that any bushings, bolts, U-bolts, or nuts are not loose or missing. The brake chamber should be properly mounted by its nuts and bolts. None should be loose or missing, and it should be free of any debris. You would also check for any dents or cracks and listen for any leaks. The slack adjuster must be properly connected to the brake chamber, and it should have less than 1 inch of free play. The brake air hoses should be properly connected by their fittings and should not be cut, cracked, or rubbing. You would also listen for any air leaks. The brake drum and the lining should have no cracks, dents, or missing parts, and the lining should not be dangerously thin. They should also be free of any oil and debris. Next, you would check the rear tires for cuts, cracks, cupping, or bulges, and make sure that each tire has more than 2/32 of tread. Tell the examiner that you would also use a tire gauge to check for proper inflation. You would check the rims for any cracks, dents, illegal welds, or missing parts. It should be properly mounted by its lug nuts. None should be loose or missing. The axle seal hub should be properly mounted by its nuts and bolts, with none loose or missing, and you would look for any leaks. Both sets of splash guards must be properly mounted by their brackets, and none of the nuts or bolts should be loose or missing. They cannot be cut, torn, or frayed. Be sure the rear lights and reflectors are clean and properly mounted, free of debris, and not cracked, broken, or missing. The tarp cannot be ripped or torn and must be secured by its ropes and cords. The tie-downs must also be securely mounted to the bed of the truck. The DOT bumper should be properly mounted by its nuts and bolts, and none are loose or missing. The bumper cannot be cracked, and the reflective tape cannot be torn or missing. Finally, turn to the examiner and ask for assistance completing the light check. Go back into the vehicle and tell the examiner which lights you are testing. Wait for the examiner to signal you OK on the light you are testing before going on to the next light. At the rear of the vehicle, test the left turn signals, right turn signals, brake lights, reverse lights, and four-way flashers. Come to the front of the cab and check the high and low beams, both turn signals, four-way flashers, and running lights. That completes your pre-trip inspection.
That's part 1 of your CDL driving test. The pre-trip inspection requires total knowledge of your truck from front to back, including the engine components, cab interior, brake check procedures, and all the exterior components that must be properly inspected. Study your manual and watch this training program several times until you're certain you can perform a complete and proper pre-trip inspection of your vehicle. Get someone to practice with you so you can get used to explaining the pre-trip inspection out loud to another person. Once you feel like you know the pre-trip inspection inside and out, move on to part 2 of this program, which is the Basic Vehicle Control Skills Test.